In the heart of Jackson, Mississippi, a scandal unfolded within the walls of a trusted police department, one that no one saw coming. A respected female officer, known for her discipline and service, was hiding a secret far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. After years of suffering in silence under the power of her commanding officer, she decided to strike back, not with a weapon, but with a virus. Her target? The very man who had once been her captain, her mentor, and, as she claimed, her abuser. What began as a cry for justice turned into a chilling act of revenge that would leave the entire city stunned and the courtroom in chaos. This is a shocking case of betrayal, abuse, and the weaponization of trust. A revenge that didn't just destroy careers, it altered lives forever. Officer Danielle Brooks was no stranger to adversity. Born and raised on the east side of Jackson, Mississippi, Danielle came from humble beginnings. Her mother was a high school English teacher, and her father worked two jobs, one as a mechanic and another as a security guard, just to keep food on the table. Growing up in a neighborhood riddled with crime, Danielle often witnessed the impact of poor policing and systemic neglect firsthand. These experiences fueled her ambition. She wanted to become the kind of officer her community could trust. Danielle graduated from Murrah High School with honors and went on to earn a degree in criminal justice from Jackson State University. Professors and classmates remember her as focused, driven, and deeply empathetic. She wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but she spoke with intention. And when she listened, which she always did carefully, people felt heard. At the age of 25, Danielle joined the Jackson Police Department, quickly rising through the ranks. Her evaluations were consistently outstanding. Supervisors praised her attention to detail, calm under pressure, and her ability to de-escalate volatile situations. In her 6-year tenure, she had received 2 commendations for bravery and led a successful neighborhood watch initiative that saw crime rates drop in one of Jackson's more troubled zones. Yet, for all professionalism, Danielle was intensely private. Colleagues knew little about her personal life. She kept to herself during breaks, rarely joined post-shift outings, and never spoke about dating or family matters. Some saw her as guarded. Others admired her discipline. Despite her quiet nature, Danielle formed a strong mentorship bond with Captain Thomas Vance, her superior officer. Vance, nearly 20 years older, was a commanding presence in the department. Charismatic, assertive, and known for running a tight but effective unit. He had taken Danielle under his wing during her early years on patrol, offering her guidance, opportunities, and at times direct praise. Many assumed their relationship was strictly professional, built on mutual respect. But beneath the surface, things were far more complicated. Privately, Danielle began confiding in a close friend from the academy, Officer Michelle Green, about the strange, sometimes uncomfortable dynamic between her and Captain Vance. He would compliment her appearance in subtle, unsettling ways. He occasionally asked her to stay late for extra paperwork that never seemed to materialize. What initially felt like mentorship began to feel controlling. But Danielle, loyal to the force and wary of jeopardizing her career, chose to keep quiet. By her 6th year on the job, Danielle had grown noticeably more withdrawn. She still performed well, but something had changed. Her once warm demeanor had become cooler, more mechanical. She stopped volunteering for community events. She declined team-building workshops. Fellow officers chalked it up to burnout. What no one knew at the time was that Danielle had been harboring a devastating secret, one that would not only explain her emotional withdrawal, but would also become the catalyst for one of the most shocking criminal cases in Mississippi law enforcement history. She had contracted HIV, and she believed she knew exactly who had infected her. As the days turned into months, Danielle wrestled with fear, shame, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. The department, the badge, the institution she had dedicated her life to, it had, in her eyes, betrayed her in the worst way. And when she finally decided to take matters into her own hands, it wasn't just about revenge. It was about exposing the truth. But the method she chose would horrify the very public she once swore to protect. Behind the uniform, Danielle Brooks was a woman burdened by pain, paralyzed by silence, and ultimately driven to a decision that would echo far beyond the walls of the police precinct. Captain Thomas Vance wasn't just a superior officer. He was a figurehead within the Jackson Police Department. With nearly 25 years in law enforcement under his belt, he commanded authority the moment he stepped into a room. Towering at over 6 feet with a booming voice and a presence that could freeze a room mid-sentence, Vance was both respected and feared in equal measure. Vance had worked his way up from patrol duty in West Jackson during the late 90s to overseeing internal affairs before eventually taking command of one of the city's most active precincts. He was a public speaker at city crime forums, a mentor to dozens of young officers, and a recipient of multiple awards for departmental excellence. On paper, he was a model officer, the kind of man the department held up as proof that the system worked. But behind closed doors, The reputation was much more complicated. Vance had a reputation among the rank and file, particularly with female officers. He was known to give preferential treatment to those he favored, often women new to the force. This favoritism wasn't overt but noticeable. Certain officers were chosen more frequently for high-profile cases. Others received praise during meetings, commendation recommendations, or sudden schedule flexibility. If one of those officers fell out of favor, however, they were quietly reassigned, ignored, or buried in paperwork-heavy cases with no room for advancement. Whispers followed Vance from precinct to precinct over the years. Some claimed he had a habit of getting too close to female subordinates, offering rides home, hovering too long during report reviews, or making comments that straddled the line between flattery and impropriety. Yet no official complaint ever stuck. Those who had spoken up were either transferred or left the force altogether. One officer, who spoke anonymously during the internal review that followed the events of the case, described him as a man who weaponized charm. To the public and city officials, he was polished and articulate, a clean-cut embodiment of the department's mission. But within the force, his power didn't stem just from his title. It came from his network. Vance had friends in the chief's office, city hall, and internal affairs. He played politics with finesse, knew which hands to shake and which rumors to silence. There had even been an incident 3 years prior that had all the signs of misconduct. A young recruit who abruptly resigned after just 6 months, citing personal reasons. Quietly, others speculated she had rebuffed Vance's advances. But without a formal report, nothing could be pursued. The case never even made it into departmental records. Danielle Brooks, as one of his protégés, was often cited as an example of his successful mentorship. He praised her during evaluations, gave her chances others didn't get. From the outside, their relationship looked like an older, seasoned officer helping a promising young recruit find her footing. But internally, Danielle later confessed to a trusted friend that his help came with subtle expectations, late-night calls under the guise of paperwork, excessive check-ins, and eventually, private meetings that made her increasingly uncomfortable. Vance had created a culture where speaking up felt dangerous. He knew the politics, the procedures, and how to make a complaint vanish in a sea of red tape. That's how he maintained power, not through overt threats, but through implied consequences. Officers learned quickly that to cross him was to risk their career. To many in the department, Captain Vance was the kind of man who had paid his dues and now lived untouchable. But to Danielle, he became something much darker, a man who used the system to protect himself while leaving others to suffer in silence. What she eventually did would shock the entire city, but to those who had worked under Vance, especially the women, it didn't come out of nowhere. For them, the chilling part wasn't just what Danielle had done, it was that some had long feared something like this might happen. At first, Officer Danielle Brooks believed she was being mentored by one of the best. Captain Thomas Vance had personally requested her transfer to Precinct 9 just months after she graduated from the academy. At roll call, he often praised her sharp instincts and paperwork precision. When she made her first arrest on a narcotics case, he invited her into his office, offered her a coffee, and said, "You've got real potential, Brooks. Not everyone gets noticed this early." What Danielle didn't realize was that this attention came with strings. It began subtly. Vance would keep her after shift for debriefs, meetings that often stretched well into the evening with no real agenda. He'd close the blinds, sit too close, and steer the conversation toward personal topics. Her dating life, her family, her confidence. At first, she brushed it off as awkward but harmless. He never laid a hand on her. But his words, his tone, the way he stood too near the door when she tried to leave, something always felt wrong. Soon, he was texting her outside of work. It wasn't about cases anymore. It was questions like, "You home safe?" or "You look tense today, want to talk?" She didn't respond at first. But in a department where Vance had the final word on promotions, ignoring him felt dangerous. So she kept up the polite responses, the short replies, hoping it would pass. It didn't. The turning point came one evening after a late shift. Vance asked her to come by his office for a private strategy session on a new gang investigation. Inside, he poured 2 glasses of scotch. Unprofessional at best, a red flag at worst. Danielle declined the drink, but Vance only smiled. "You've got to loosen up," he said, sitting on the edge of his desk, arms folded. Danielle left that night shaken. She began documenting everything, the texts, the meetings, the comments. But even with her growing discomfort, she knew going to HR could backfire. Others had tried before. Some ended up reassigned. Others quietly resigned. Alone, cornered, and with no real support, Danielle's unease turned into something colder, resentment. And resentment, in silence, can grow into revenge. Danielle Brooks had always believed that wearing the badge meant standing for justice, until she found herself silenced by the very institution meant to protect her. What she endured behind the locked doors of Precinct 9 wasn't just misconduct. It was an insidious abuse of power that left her both traumatized and ignored. According to Danielle, the violations weren't sudden. They escalated, starting with inappropriate comments, then unwanted physical proximity, and eventually direct coercion. She described moments where Captain Vance would corner her in his office, lowering his voice while brushing his hand against her arm or back. One evening, after declining an invitation to join him at a private law enforcement gala, she found herself reassigned to desk duty. Without explanation, and with her previous arrest reports flagged for review, Danielle suspected retaliation. When she brought her discomfort to a trusted senior officer, she was met with a knowing look and a warning. "He's protected," the officer said flatly. "Don't poke the bear." But things got worse. Danielle recounted a night when Vance insisted she join him on an out-of-town surveillance operation. He made it clear, either she went or she'd lose her lead on the gang case she had spent months building. Feeling cornered and fearful for her career, she agreed. That night, in a hotel room booked for safety reasons, she says Vance crossed a line. Danielle didn't give explicit details at first, but she later disclosed to an internal advocate that she had been sexually coerced. Even with a written report, there was no investigation. HR informed her that insufficient evidence and lack of corroborating witnesses prevented any further action. Worse, her complaint leaked. Whispers started. Some colleagues avoided her. Others mocked her quietly behind her back, calling her dramatic or too emotional for the job. The institution that trained her to seek justice had turned its back. Danielle felt trapped in her career, in her trauma, in silence. She carried on with work, outwardly calm, inwardly unraveling. Her claims had been dismissed, her fears invalidated, and her abuser was still in command. As her trust in the system crumbled, so did the boundaries of her morality. And what followed wasn't just a reaction, it was a calculated reckoning. The day Danielle Brooks received her diagnosis, the fluorescent lights of the urgent care clinic seemed harsher than ever. She had gone in for what she believed was a routine illness, fatigue, mild fevers, and muscle aches she couldn't shake. But after a series of tests and a long, uneasy wait in a sterile room, the doctor returned with a grave look. "Danielle, you've tested positive for HIV." The words dropped like a bomb. She sat there, stunned, staring ahead, unable to process the sentence. The doctor spoke softly, explaining the next steps, offering support, listing resources, but Danielle heard none of it. All she could think was, how? She had always been careful, responsible. She hadn't been in a relationship since breaking off a short-lived engagement 2 years earlier. Her mind began racing, and then it stopped. One name flashed through her thoughts like lightning: Captain Vance. The realization settled in with crushing weight. Not only had he used his power to manipulate her, but now he had changed her life forever. The despair was immediate and consuming. Danielle withdrew from friends, turned off her phone, and stopped showing up to work for 3 days. Shame and rage intermingled as she stared blankly at the ceiling of her apartment, over and over again thinking, no one believed me. No one protected me. She thought about the complaint she filed, the warnings she gave, the silence that followed. The institution had failed her, and now she had to live with a sentence she never deserved. What began as a violation of power had now become a death sentence in her mind. But for Danielle, that moment of devastation was also the beginning of something darker, a shift from victimhood to something far more dangerous. Danielle Brooks didn't act out of impulse. Her revenge was deliberate, calculated, and methodically carried out over several weeks. After her diagnosis, a storm brewed inside her. No amount of therapy or internal reckoning could undo the damage. She felt cornered, unheard, and abandoned by the system meant to protect her. So she devised a plan, one that would give her a sense of control, even if it meant walking a moral tightrope. She resumed work at the precinct with an unsettling calm. No outbursts, no signs of inner turmoil, just professionalism, masks of cordiality, and subtle proximity to Captain Vance. She knew his habits, how he lingered in the office late, how he trusted her, how he craved privacy in the same setting where he'd once crossed a line. She used his arrogance against him. There were moments, intimate ones behind closed doors, where she allowed him access again. It was a trap, dressed in silence and restraint. She made sure there was no protection, no suspicion, and no indication of her condition. It was revenge laced in stillness. While he remained oblivious, confident in his dominance, Danielle wore a uniform composure. Knowing every passing day brought her plan closer to impact. The truth didn't come out with fanfare or a whistleblower's bold confession. Instead, It slipped through the cracks: a leaked medical report, an anonymous tip, and a quiet investigation that suddenly spiraled beyond anyone's control. Months after Danielle's complaint had been buried, an independent audit of the department's handling of misconduct cases uncovered irregularities. The medical report, initially sealed, detailed injuries consistent with Danielle's claims, contradicting the department's official stance. Whispers turned into murmurs, then a wave of outrage. Faced with mounting evidence and a growing media storm, Precinct 9's leadership was forced to act. Captain Vance was placed on administrative leave pending investigation, but the damage was done. Public trust in the department shattered overnight. Protesters gathered outside the precinct, chanting for justice, demanding accountability. Within the department, reactions were fractured. Some officers expressed shock, others denial. A few offered quiet support to Danielle, while many others kept their distance, fearful of the fallout. For Danielle, the exposure was a double-edged sword. Relief that her truth was finally heard, but shock at the scale of betrayal around her. The fight was far from over. When the criminal trial finally began, the eyes of the city were fixed on Precinct 9's courtroom. Captain Thomas Vance faced multiple charges: sexual coercion, abuse of power, and retaliation against Officer Danielle Brooks. It was a rare moment of reckoning in a system often accused of protecting its own. The prosecution laid out a meticulously detailed case. They called Danielle to the stand, where she recounted the months of intimidation, the unwanted advances, the night in a hotel room that changed everything. Her testimony was raw and unflinching, painting a picture of a trusted leader who weaponizes authority to silence and control. Medical reports, text messages, and witness accounts from colleagues who had noticed her sudden reassignment and changed demeanor added weight to her story. Vance's defense, however, was relentless. His attorneys portrayed Danielle as ambitious but unstable, a young officer who misunderstood his mentorship and exaggerated interactions out of frustration and career jealousy. They attacked her credibility, highlighting moments where she hesitated or seemed uncertain, and suggested that the department's previous decision not to pursue her complaint was due to lack of evidence, not a cover-up. They brought in character witnesses praising Vance's decades of service and leadership, casting doubt on the possibility of misconduct. As the trial unfolded, the courtroom became a battleground of power and perception. The prosecution's key strategy was to expose the culture of silence and intimidation within the police department, how loyalty often trumped justice. The defense aimed to maintain the status quo, warning that a conviction would damage the entire force's morale and reputation. In a dramatic cross-examination, Danielle held her ground despite aggressive questioning, her resolve strengthening as she faced down the man who once held her future in his hands. Witnesses from within the department gave conflicting accounts, some supporting Danielle's claims, others reluctant to speak openly. After weeks of testimony, the jury was left to weigh not only the facts of the case, but the broader implications for a justice system struggling to police itself. The trial became more than a personal battle. It was a referendum on accountability, trust, and the cost of speaking out. After days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict that shocked many within and outside the police force. Captain Thomas Vance was found guilty on multiple counts, including sexual coercion and abuse of power. The decision sent ripples through the community, signaling a rare victory for victims who dared to speak against entrenched authority. The sentencing hearing that followed was tense and emotional. The judge, emphasizing the seriousness of the crimes and the betrayal of trust, handed down a sentence of 7 years in state prison, alongside mandatory counseling and a permanent ban from law enforcement roles. The sentence was seen by many as a harsh but necessary statement, a message that no one was above the law. Danielle Brooks sat silently through the verdict, her expression a mixture of relief and exhaustion. For years, she had carried the burden alone, and now justice had finally been served. Speaking afterward, she expressed hope that her case would encourage others to come forward and challenge a culture of silence. "This isn't just about me," she said. "It's about changing a system that allowed this to happen." Vance's family, however, reacted with disbelief and anger. His wife released a statement calling the verdict a miscarriage of justice and accused the media and the prosecution of destroying a man who had dedicated his life to protecting the community. His adult children were divided. Some stood by their father, while others privately expressed shock and sorrow. The broader police community was left to grapple with the fallout. While some officers viewed the verdict as a painful but necessary reckoning, others feared it would undermine morale and trust in leadership. In the aftermath, Danielle's story became a catalyst for change, sparking policy reviews, training reforms, and a renewed push for transparency. Yet, the scars remained, for her, for the department, and for a city forced to confront a dark truth hidden in plain sight. The verdict against Captain Thomas Vance marked a watershed moment. not just for Danielle Brooks, but for the entire police department and the community it served. Yet, change came slowly and unevenly, exposing deep fractures within the institution. In the months following the trial, Precinct 9 underwent a series of reforms aimed at rebuilding trust. New policies mandated clearer reporting procedures for misconduct and established anonymous hotlines for officers to voice concerns without fear of retaliation. Leadership training now included sessions on power dynamics and harassment, signaling a shift toward accountability. However, many officers remained skeptical, seeing these changes as symbolic rather than substantive. Public response was mixed but fervent. Community groups hailed Danielle's courage as a beacon of hope, organizing rallies and forums on police reform and workplace safety. Media outlets chronicled the case as emblematic of a broader cultural problem in law enforcement nationwide. At the same time, debates raged over due process, the risks of false accusations, and potential damage to police morale. Inside the department, the moral debates were raw and personal. Some colleagues quietly supported Danielle, recognizing the necessity of confronting abuse within their ranks. Others resented the attention, feeling that the case cast an unfair shadow on hardworking officers. The division underscored the challenge of changing entrenched cultures where loyalty often trumped justice. As for the central figures, Danielle Brooks continued her career in law enforcement, but on her own terms. She transferred to a different precinct, took on an active role in advocating for officers' rights and safer work environments, and became a mentor for young recruits navigating a difficult profession. Her experience left her guarded but resolute, a survivor determined to transform pain into progress. Captain Vance remains incarcerated, his name a cautionary tale whispered among officers about the cost of abusing power. Attempts to appeal his conviction have so far been unsuccessful, and he is serving his sentence in a state correctional facility. The case left an indelible mark, one that forced a reckoning with uncomfortable truths and sparked a cautious hope for a future where justice might finally be blind to rank and privilege.